Welcome to Part 9. Mercantilism was the basic policy imposed by Great Britain on its overseas possessions. Mercantilism meant that the government and the merchants became partners with the goal of increasing political power and private wealth, to the exclusion of other empires. The government protected its merchants, and kept others out, by trade barriers, regulations, and subsidies to domestic industries to maximize exports from and minimize imports to the realm. The government had to fight smuggling, which became a favorite American technique in the 18th century to circumvent the restrictions on trading with the French, Spanish or Dutch. The goal of mercantilism was to run trade surpluses, so that gold and silver would pour into London. The government took its share through duties and taxes, with the remainder going to merchants in London and other British ports. The government spent much of its revenue on a superb Royal Navy, which not only protected the British colonies but threatened the colonies of the other empires, and sometimes seized them. Thus the Royal Navy captured New Amsterdam, later New York City, in 1664. The colonies were captive markets for British industry, and the goal was to enrich the mother country. Loss of the 13 American colonies. During the 1760s and 1770s, relations with the 13 colonies turned from benign neglect to outright revolt, primarily because of the British Parliament's insistence on taxing colonists without their consent to recover losses incurred protecting the American colonists during the French and Indian War, 1754–1763. In 1775, the American Revolutionary War began at the battles of Lexington and Concord, and the Americans then trapped the British Army in Boston in the Siege of Boston and suppressed the Loyalists who supported the Crown. On the 4th of July 1776, the Second Continental Congress, representing the 13 colonies, unanimously adopted and issued the Declaration of Independence. The Second Continental Congress charged the Committee of Five with authoring the Declaration, but the committee, in turn, largely relied on Thomas Jefferson, who authored its first draft. Under the military leadership of Continental Army General George Washington and with some economic and military assistance from France, the Dutch Republic, and Spain, the United States held off successive British invasions. The Americans captured two main British armies in 1777 and 1781. After that, King George III lost control of Parliament and was unable to continue the war, which was brought to an end with the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1783, which acknowledged the independence and sovereignty of the 13 colonies and recognized the United States. The American Revolutionary War, which lasted from 1775 to 1783, was expensive but the British financed it successfully. Approximately 8,500 British troops were killed in action during the war. After a series of French and Indian Wars, the British took over most of France's North American operations in 1763. New France became Quebec. Great Britain's policy was to respect Quebec's Catholic establishment as well as its semi-feudal legal, economic, and social systems. By the Quebec Act of 1774, the province of Quebec was enlarged to include the western holdings of the American colonies. In the American Revolutionary War, Halifax, Nova Scotia became Britain's major base for naval action. They repulsed an American Revolutionary invasion in 1776, but in 1777 a British invasion army was captured in New York, encouraging France to enter the war. 75. After the American victory, between 40,000 and 60,000 defeated Loyalists migrated, some bringing their slaves. 76. Most families were given free land to compensate their losses. Several thousand free blacks also arrived, most of them later went to Sierra Leone in Africa. 77. The 14,000 Loyalists who went to the St. John and St. Croix River valleys, then part of Nova Scotia, were not welcomed by the locals. Therefore, in 1784 the British split off New Brunswick as a separate colony. The Constitutional Act of 1791 created the provinces of Upper Canada, mainly English-speaking, and Lower Canada, mainly French-speaking, to diffuse tensions between the French and English-speaking communities, and implemented governmental systems similar to those employed in Great Britain, with the intention of asserting imperial authority and not allowing the sort of popular control of government that was perceived to have led to the American Revolution. In 1770, British explorer James Cook had discovered the eastern coast of Australia whilst on a scientific voyage to the South Pacific. In 1778, Joseph Banks, Cook's botanist on the voyage, presented evidence to the government on the suitability of Botany Bay for the establishment of a penal settlement. Australia marks the beginning of the Second British Empire. It was planned by the government in London and designed as a replacement for the lost American colonies. The American loyalist James Matra in 1783 wrote a proposal for establishing a settlement in New South Wales, proposing the establishment of a colony composed of American loyalists, Chinese and South Sea Islanders, but not convicts. Matra reasoned that the land was suitable for plantations of sugar, cotton and tobacco. New Zealand timber and hemp or flax could prove valuable commodities, it could form a base for Pacific trade, and it could be a suitable compensation for displaced American loyalists. At the suggestion of Secretary of State Lord Sydney, Matra amended his proposal to include convicts as settlers, considering that this would benefit both economy to the public and humanity to the individual. The government adopted the basics of Matra's plan in 1784, and funded the settlement of convicts. In 1787 the first fleet set sail, carrying the first shipment of convicts to the colony. It arrived in January 1788. Part 10 will be continued.